Hey, what's going on, everyone? It's Alex from Alex Creates Music, and today I'm going to walk you through how to create an alternative style punk rock song. I'm going to go ahead and play a small section of the song for you so that you can hear what it sounds like, and then we're going to go ahead and dive in and take a closer look at some of the elements that make up this style of music. So before we get started, just a quick background on myself. I'm a musician, producer, engineer, and I grew up listening to a lot of alternative rock and punk rock kind of like this. So this is something that's a little more near and dear to me and something that I have a lot of experience with since it first coming out in probably the early 2000s. I love working with artists who have a rough idea for a song and then developing it out with them into a more fleshed out version of a song, kind of like what we're about to listen to. So definitely get in touch if you have an idea that you'd like to fully develop. I'd be happy to work with you. So for an alternative punk song like this, there's a few main characteristics that are generally going to be followed in these types of songs. The first one is going to be a faster tempo. So as you can see, I've got this set to a nice leisurely 177 BPM. The other thing is going to be the drums. It's just going to use a basic punk beat, which is just kind of kick, kick, snare, kick, kick, snare. So you've got your snare on the 2 and the 4. You've got 2 kicks preceding those. I actually programmed that out initially while writing the chorus in using Get Good drums, just these MIDI drums. So the basic punk beat sounds like this. Which, if you've heard any kind of punk song, Blink-182, Green Day, Sum 41, that's kind of showing my age, but that's the basic tenet of those. Most punk songs will use some kind of variation of that beat that's built off of that kind of kick-kick-snare structure. The third part of building a rock song like this is going to be the guitars. So with a lot of alternative rock and just any type of rock, really, you're going to encounter a lot of Marshall amps. So using some sort of variation of that, for this I'm using the Fortin Nameless amp, and then also blending that in with a Mesa Boogie dual rectifier modeler. That's going to give you a nice blend of these huge, distorted, but pretty present guitars that can really cut through the mix, since this is all going to be pretty aggressive throughout the mix and be pretty dense. Lastly, the bass guitar is going to be just on the edge of breakup through the amp simulator that I'm using, and that's going to be just so it can fight with the guitars a little bit more and kind of create a more cohesive blend between the guitars and the bass, so they essentially sound like one unit. So if we take a look at the structure of this, I started off by writing the chorus, which is just a basic 3-chord progression. It's a D to a G to an A sharp. And with that, it's just use power chords and some octaves. So most songs like this are going to stick to that similar kind of structure, where it's just using basic power chords, octaves to reinforce that. And then a lot of the melody is going to be carried by the vocal. So if we listen to the basic part of the chorus here, you can hear it's just those 3 chords repeated across a few bars. Typically in this style of music, your verse is going to be pretty sparse comparatively, with maybe just a little bit of guitar. So with this one, it's really just bass and drums. And you can hear that that bass is kind of just a little dirty, but it's not super overdriven or distorted just yet. It's just kind of keeping pace. And then we have a guitar coming in here. So with the guitar in the verses, and you can hear I have a little bit of delay on that, it's mainly just picked out some of the notes that were utilized in those chords, because again, your verse is going to be where you're making your main statement vocally, so you don't want that super dense just yet, and that's also going to create a nice contrast between the chorus when that opens up into something much larger. Then we have the bridge, or the middle 8. With these, it uses a lot of the same chords, just in a different arrangement, and this again is going to be fairly sparse, kind of like the verse, because you want this to create a good distinction between your choruses, which are real high energy, and this is going to be going into the outro, which is where you want your song to reach its kind of maximum height on here. So this is going to be a little bit more low key so that it really builds up into the final chorus. And I'll listen to the last few bars of this here as it goes into the outro. And then the last trick I used in songwriting like this is if you go to a halftime beat, which is if you're playing the drums, you've got your snare on the 2 and 4, you can change that so that the snare is instead only once per measure on the 3, and that gives the listener kind of the impression that the song's tempo has been cut in half. So that can really add a really nice change in dynamic, particularly either in the middle 8 section or at the end of a outro, which is exactly what I did here. So I'll play this going into the outro and kind of count where the snares are. So 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's a cool way to just kind of change the momentum of the track at any given point inside the song. So now that we've covered the songwriting and arrangement style, let's dig into some of the nerdy audio stuff here. So if we start off with the drums, I've basically recorded all of the individual tracks on my drum set here, so overheads, some kick, snare, and tom mics. And with the drum set in particular, I'm approaching it kind of in the same way on the individual tracks, which we'll get to in a second. But on the bus processing, I'm using this front DAW, which is just kind of like a input channel emulator. This kind of changes the signal a little bit, gives it a little bit of color. Going into this other channel strip, the Universal Audio API Vision channel strip. This is just adding a little bit of EQ, giving it a boost in the top end, a little more low end, and cutting out some of the mids around 700. And then a large part of the drum sound that I use is coming from the API 2500 bus compressor, also by Universal Audio. It's giving a really kind of thick and present sound once you put the drums through this. You can hear that it brings up the level of everything and really kind of clamps down on the snare pretty aggressively, which brings the drums really forward in the mix. So I'll let you hear what that sounds like turning on and off the compressor. So you can hear with that, it's doing almost up to 4 decibels of gain reduction on the snare hits, and that gives it a pretty aggressive tone. And then lastly, in this signal chain, I'm just doing a little bit of clipping, and really all this is doing is clamping down on some of the louder snare hits. I don't want those peaks to be quite as extravagant as they're going towards the mix bus, so that it's not triggering the bus compressor I have at the end of my chain to give you that kind of pumping feel, but I want this to be kind of as loud and in your face as possible without sounding too compressed. So if we go into the individual tracks of the drums, again, I've kind of done the same thing. This front DAW is going to be on all of the channels, and then I'll do some subtractive EQ and some light compression. So if we just listen to the overheads here, you can hear I'm basically only using this as a cymbal mic. But again, with these 3 first plugins, I'm doing this pretty much on every channel to kind of emulate what it would be like if you were tracking through analog gear. Typically, when you're tracking in, you're going to do a little bit of corrective EQ, maybe some light compression coming in on the way in. So with that, I've just set that up to emulate how I would normally track if I was, at a console or in a recording studio using analog gear. And then the second half of all of these is where I'm going to be adding more of the character to the different tracks. So for instance, the kick in on here, doing a little bit of subtractive EQ, and then I'm just further shaping the tone with this SSL style plugin here. And I've also got this kick trigger at a low volume in here. This I'm just using from Slate Trigger 2. This is kind of the world famous Kick 10 sample, which was used in all kinds of rock stuff on thousands of records. So really what this is doing is providing the same sample hit after hit. I don't really have this so it's super audible and changing the characteristic of the kick drum, but it's really just providing a little bit more consistent weight in the kind of low end of the kick drum. So if I take it in and out, you can sort of hear that. So adding a little bit more weight in the low end. For the snare, doing a similar thing, subtractive EQ, a little bit of compression. Got a snare reverb on here, which is just going to this is the Little Plate by Sound Toys. Giving it pretty decent boost in the high end, taking out some around maybe 400, 440 hertz, adding a little bit more weight in the body of the drum. Got the snare bottom microphone in here, where I've really just inverted the phase, done some subtractive EQing. And then like the kick, I've got a snare trigger at a lower volume. This one, I believe I'm also using the pretty famous Snare 12A, which again is kind of a one that's used a lot in modern rock music. And that's really just blended in with the live snare, just to give it a little bit more consistency, but not really to change the character. So without the sample. With the sample. Similar to the kick, you can kind of hear that low-mid area. It's just having a little bit more consistency from hit to hit. It's not really changing the overall tone. And then with both of the toms, if I loop one of the sections here, just again doing corrective EQ, gating out some of the parts where the tom isn't being hit, and adding a decent bit of EQ on the fundamental of the note and the stick attack to just keep that sustain on the toms a little more consistent. So again, the drums. So now let's move on to the guitars. So moving on to the guitars, I've got my Telecaster that I tracked through this Neural DSP Fortin Nameless plugin. This is an emulation of a modified Marshall amp that's a little more high gain. I've just got it on the Modern Rock preset and tweaked it a little bit on the settings. So with this one, double tracked it, panned it left and right to create a wider sense of just sound on there. And with this and with most Marshall amps, you'll notice that they have more of an accentuated mid presence in there. So if I solo just these Marshalls, it's going to sound pretty mid-focused and maybe a little too bright on its own. But it's giving it that nice kind of gritty rock characteristic. Now to back that up, since that doesn't have a whole lot of low end, I actually recorded on my Stratocaster. It's a blacktop Stratocaster, so it's got humbuckers. I recorded that through this modeler of a Mesa Boogie dual rectifier. And if you listen to these, same deal, double track this left and right, this has a lot more bottom end response. Once that's paired with the Marshall, they really mesh together pretty well. And this is the combo that's really responsible for a lot of that modern rock sound. So let's listen to this on its own. With the Marshall. So you can hear those blend together pretty well. And then I've also double tracked an octave down here on the same Telecaster Marshall combo. That's what this sounds like. It's just the root note and an octave up, so it's not really super dense. But played in conjunction with the other guitar tracks, that's going to give a little more reinforcement to the root notes and have a little bit more high-end response just where those notes are. So if we listen to this in context with the other guitars, I'm actually going to do this in the outro because I've made it so that this is actually a little louder in the final outro rather than its quieter part in the first two choruses. So you can really hear it in this section. Take it out there. Put it back in. So again, with the guitars, a lot of the modern rock sound, especially in this kind of alternative punk genre, is due to the combination of having a Marshall-style amp double-tracked with a Mesa Boogie kind of dual rectifier-style amp. So that gives you the best of both worlds, where you've got the high-mid sound of the Marshall amp combined with the lower weight of the Mesa Boogie, and then adding an octave up to double that. So that creates this really big kind of in-your-face wall of sound approach to this, which is going to be really meshing well with the aggressiveness of the drums and the bass. Lastly, we have the bass guitar. Now for this, I'm just going a DI direct into my Universal Audio Apollo interface, running it through some light compression just to catch some of the peaks, and then I'm actually putting it in Guitar Rig through this Ampeg SVT Pro emulation, doing a good bit of compression on the way in also to keep the bass just real consistent because you want that to stay real constant in this type of music, and then just doing some EQing. I've got the mids pushed up a good bit and the gain up a good bit, so it's just on the verge of breakup and creates that real gritty sound that blends in well with the guitars. So here's the bass on its own. And then once we blend in the guitars, these are going to sound like one real thick, cohesive unit. I'm actually doing some multi-band compression here. What this does is keeps the low end in check. It's only compressing everything below 188 hertz on this. And that's really just making it so that when the low end builds up too much, if you're banging on one of the open strings, it's going to compress it a lot more after it crosses this threshold. So again, that goes in keeping the bass pretty consistent through the mix. And then again, just adding a little bit of EQ on here, boosting a little bit of the bass, a little bit of the pick attack area, and then cutting out some of the kind of mids on there. So for my master channel, what I've got going on here is just a basic EQ that's cutting off things at about 30 hertz. Sometimes I'll do a little bit of corrective EQ in here, but I was pretty happy with how the mix was sounding just from the start with that. I have this Townhouse bus compressor, which is kind of a more aggressive SSL style bus compressor. And really this is doing some compression just to bring everything a little bit more forward in the mix and give it a little bit more edge. So here's it on, off, back on. So you can hear it's adding a little bit more aggression and kind of keeping everything more in the same dynamic range. The danger in this is you don't want to go super compressed, so it's just all one solid brick wall, but this does add a really good characteristic to it. After that, I'm going into the Universal Audio Studer tape. And what this is really doing is just adding a little bit more girth in some of the low mids, and it's shaping the transients, particularly the drums, in kind of a pleasing way. This is emulating tape, and the way that tape naturally works is once it passes a certain threshold, it can't really replicate super quick spikes real accurately, so it kind of curves those off in a very pleasing musical way. So this is just doing a little bit more shaping for the drums and adding a little bit more saturation for the mix. And then lastly, for the mastering section, which I've got split into the second channel group here, I'm just doing some EQing on here using the Chandler Curve Bender. So on this, I'm doing mid-side processing where I'm adding in 12 kilohertz, a little bit on both the mids and the sides. But on the sides here, I'm taking out a little bit more of the low end than I am on just the middle, and that creates a little bit of a wider stereo image. In addition to that, I'm also adding a little bit of a presence boost around 1.2 kilohertz and the sides, just again to create more of that wide stereo image. After that, I'm going into iZotope Ozone, doing some multi-band compression here. And what that's doing is just compressing the individual frequency bands of the mix just individually without compressing the mix as a whole. So this gives you a little more finite control where it can really clamp down on some of the transients like the snare. Adding a little bit of excitement, just some extra saturation basically in this low mid band. So this is just going to add a little bit more harmonic saturation in this band where I thought it was a little kind of lacking. After that, I'm running it through this black box, which again is a saturator, and this just kind of helps add a little bit more harmonic content. Makes it sound a little thicker. And then lastly, just using kind of the standard ozone limiter here, I've got it in the IRC4 modern setting, and just bringing it up to about -9 RMS. Which I found to be pretty competitive with just the average loudness for songs in this kind of genre. So that pretty much wraps up the mix and the song arrangement. As you can hear, this is just instrumental at this point. It doesn't have any vocals because I can't sing. So if you've got a cool vocal idea, definitely send me a message. I'd love to collaborate on this, get some vocals on top of it, maybe put it out. So please like and subscribe if you like this video. I'm going to be putting out more of these as the weeks go by, just doing different types of genres more in the rock sense, and then analyzing different types of bands that I like and listen to and how they write music and mix their stuff. So I'm going to let this play from start to finish so that you can hear the finalized result. Please let me know what you think, and if there's anything you do differently or different songwriting techniques or audio engineering tips that you have that work with this particular genre. So let me know what you want to see in the future, and I hope to see you on the next video. Thanks again.